writings possess a story of rich quality that illuminates the human spirit. He works those universal questions we all ask ourselves in our own journeys. Where am I from? Where do I belong? And who I am in this world. Without further ado, our keynote, Richard Blanco.
It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you today for several reasons. First, although I would just want to thank all the sponsors of tonight's event. Of course, Conexion, of course, Phyllis, whom I did not get a phone call from, but I got an email. I didn't need the phone call because as soon as I learned what Conexion was all about, I realized it was going to be a great fit. They say that every writer, in some ways, is writing the same poem or the same story or the same novel, etc., all their life. And what that means, of course, figuratively, is that in some ways, all writers, or maybe even all artists, are informed by some kind of obsession, some kind of central obsession in which all their work is informed by, right? And their whole body of work is in some ways an attempt to answer questions about that obsession, to dimension that obsession, to ask new questions about that obsession. And in some ways, that's just sort of what we revolve around. For me, that obsession comes down to one single word, and it's home. Home, that big word home, which is like asking what is love, right? And all that big word calls into mind in terms of community, in terms of place, in terms of family, in terms of cultural identity, in terms of national loyalties, in terms of heritage, all that big word calls to mind. And I think it's an obsession that in some ways we all share in the room, right? In some ways. This idea of where we come from is so essential to understand who we are and where we're going. And that's part of the journey that my writing describes. It's an obsession that actually I marvel at how I stumbled into this obsession, but it's an obsession that began perhaps before I was even born. As Oz was saying, I was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States. And what that meant, by the time my mother left Cuba 7 months pregnant. And we immigrated to Madrid first, and I was born. And 45 days later, after my birth, we emigrated once again. So if there was a higher power sort of up there going, guess what little Ricky's going to be obsessed about when he grows up and becomes a writer or a poet, is this idea of home. By the time I was 45 days old, I belonged to 3 countries, Cuba, Spain, and the United States. I had lived in 2 world-class cities. I had lived in New York City and in Madrid. And this is un recordatorio, or a memento of my birth. And I'd like to show it also because that newborn photo that you see, that's my very first photo, which luckily I have the same hair. I haven't lost that. It's kind of like a FOMO, isn't it? But anyway, that newborn photo was my green card photo. That was my first ID in the United States. And then just to screw with me, they threw in the Eiffel Tower and the Swiss Alps there. It was like, I remember looking at this when I was a kid going, where the hell are we from again? like this doesn't look like Cuba with snow and mountains. I don't understand. But anyway, that's what started the whole obsession, that whole quest and that questioning of what is home, where do I belong in the world, which is really another way of asking who am I, right? How important these questions are. That narrative continued when we moved to Miami, galaxy very far, far away from New York City. The only place where my father could get away wearing those Speedos. And anybody that's from Miami, has lived in Miami, or even visited Miami for 20 minutes, realizes it's a very special place. And even more so in the 1970s and 80s, because it was like growing up between 2 real imagined worlds. One, of course, was the 1950s and 60s Cuba of my parents and my grandparents and the community at large. This homeland that we came from, this paradise, and you know how Cubans can get about Cuba, where the sugar was sweeter and the mangoes were tastier and the salt was saltier and all this stuff. A place that felt very real and yet completely imaginary because, hell, I had never been there, right? So it was all something to do with photographs and pictures and stories and family lore. But the other not so obvious imaginary place, and this is where growing up in Miami, I realized is in a way, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It was a very privileged way to grow up because in some ways I grew up in a very undiverse community, in a very undiverse city. Everybody was Cuban. I never felt so much like the other, which was good to grow up in, but later brought some other difficulties. As we like to say in Miami, we love living there because it's so close to the United States and you don't need a passport. But the idea was that, and it was across the whole socioeconomic spectrum, right? It was from the gardener to the lawyer, from the butcher to the mayor, everybody was Cuban. So everybody was kind of just like me, and it was kind of a reverse xenophobia in a way, and a reverse kind of prejudice, which I always hold as a kind of interesting sort of marker for me to understand that all these things are in some ways relative. The guy that got picked on in my class was Brian Kunkel because, first of all, he had a weird last name, which we thought was Americano. But he also had freckles. I had never seen freckles. Like, none of us were like, what are those things on your face? Anyway, so the other real imagined world was America in some ways. It was this place that I still hadn't been to in some ways. And how I contextualized and thought about it was like any good 7-year-old kid was like through television and TV commercials. I still watch reruns of the Brady Bunch. I'm still trying to figure out where are they? How can I get there? Like this kind of thing. And of course that's the picture that looks like me and Oz, doesn't it? a little bit. I had to nix Alice, unfortunately, on that one, who was my favorite character. Anyway, the idea was that growing up and sort of thinking about negotiating between these two worlds, and I think there's somewhat of a little bit of a misunderstanding, or nuance, I should say, about that. This may seem contrary. It's not like I wanted to be the Brady Bunch. It's just that generationally, I think people tend to think that children of immigrants or immigrants themselves, that they just accept their given culture. And especially with the children, it's a generational thing. It's really a process of growing what I call a cultural coming of age process. Your parents, whatever your parents are doing, are automatic grounds for rejection, right? If they're dancing salsa, you want to listen to AC/DC. They're watching the telenovelas on Canal 23, you want to watch the Brady Bunch, right? So it's really much of my writing is about how we grow into our culture, this cultural coming of age to finally really understand that they're not just dumb stories that our parents were telling us, that they're real and true and honest, and that they're a part of the very fabric of who we are. And so a lot of the writing sort of is that journey. So I'll start with this poem, which is in that vein of little Ricky sort of having this dilemma about his name. I'll let you enjoy that for a minute. And I won't give away the poem because what you get what I'm saying, right? We grow up with this tension of wanting to be and thinking we're all this Americano stuff, but at the same time we're not as we think we were. So in this poem, little Ricky is sort of struggling or navigating that sort of that psychic space between those two real imagined worlds and trying to think about his loyalties to culture, what they mean, and all this kind of stuff. And it's just a whimsical look at something that has troubled me all my life, which is my name. I love my name in Spanish, but I can't stand my name in English. And I'm giving too much of the poem away. Anyway, but these are all of the Richards in my life, right? I think we're not to date anybody, but you're laughing. So you're Richard Gears, you're Richie Cunningham. I was actually named after Richard Nixon. And of course, this is what you get when an engineer becomes a poet. You got to keep me away from the PowerPoint presentations, but that's obviously me in the middle, which will make sense in a minute. Okay, so here we go. The name I wanted. Not Ricardo, but Richard. Because I felt like Richard Burton, a true Anglo-Saxon in tights, reciting lines from Othello. because I wanted to be as handsome as Richard Gere in a white tuxedo, because I had a pinky ring just like Richard Dawson on Family Feud, because I knew I could be just as wholesome as Richie Cunningham, just as American as my father's favorite president, Nixon. Richard, not Ricardo, not my nicknames either. El Negrito, the little black boy from my skin the color of dried tobacco when I was born, or El Galleguito, the little Galician, because that's what Tio Noelia called anyone like me, born in Spain, not 100% Cuban. And not Rico, the name Lupe wrote on my desk, branding me as Barry Manilow's Latin lover in ruffled sleeves dancing conga at the Copacabana, all of 8th grade. And definitely not Ricardito, little Ricky, worse than Dick. Richard, descendant of British royals, not the shepherds on my mother's family, nor the plantain farmers on my father's side. Richard, name of German composers, not the swish of machetes, rapping of bongos. Richard, more elegant than my grandfather in his polyester suit with chiclets jingling in his pocket, more refined than my grandmother gnawing at mangoes and passing gas at the kitchen sink. Ricardo de Jesus Blanco, I dub thee myself Sir Richard Jesus White. Defender of my own country, protector of my own wishes, conqueror of mirrors, sovereign of my imagination, a name for my name. Again, this is about the journey. Really flash forward. Those same issues of cultural identity, of home, of belonging, of course, pursued me to this day. I still think a lot about what home is and what that means. But at a certain point, it's natural, right, and especially for children of immigrants, of exiles, to ask, well, where are our parents from? Where is that mythic Cuba? Where's that on the map? What's going on with that? And for me, those questions were particularly poignant when it came to my mother. My mother left her entire family in Cuba. And you know for Latinos what that means, and you know it's a big family. She had 8 brothers and sisters left behind. Her parents left behind. Every aunt and uncle, every niece and nephew, every cousin, every living relative that she knew. And we always grew up with a sense of sort of grew up with half a family in a way and half a mother in some ways emotionally, and always grew up sensing her sense of longing and loss and whatnot. But when the White House called, they actually asked me to write 3 poems, not just one. They had to write 3 poems in 3 weeks. I don't know why they made the Cuban write 3 poems. Nobody else has had to write 3 poems. Kind of pisses me off. It's like, what? One isn't good enough, folks? Like, come on. But granted, they were short on time, and anyway, I'm not going to get into it. But the idea, for the 3rd poem, I turned to my mother's journey because I realized it wasn't just about loss and longing. It was about, my mother's story is a quintessential American dream story. In a way, it's about faith. The faith she must have had to make that leap to a country como una guajira that she hardly, she just knew from what she read in books or whatnot, but she didn't really have a consciousness of what America was about. And so I realized that in some ways, my mother is more of an American than I could ever be. She was the one that should have read that poem in Washington, not me. Her faith, her courage, what it took for her to believe in this country was just immense. And so for this 3rd poem, I turned to her in that sense. That's her with me at the inauguration. She's the one who I took to sit next to me, much to the generosity of my partner who's here, Mark, who said, "You need to take your mother. This is her story." And he made me realize that, right? And that's obviously one of my favorite photos of her in Cuba before I was even born, unaware of the journey before her. Anyway, this poem asks us to put ourselves, all of America, sort of in my mother's emotional shoes, and think about if we all had to sort of get up from this room and in 4 hours pack a suitcase and leave everything you've ever known behind, how might we engage our country differently? How might we appreciate our country differently? But also, how might we fight or put up a fight differently if we knew that everything that, so it's a way of appreciating and sort of also sort of riling up the troops, so to speak. Mother country, madre patria. To love a country as if you've lost one. 1968, my mother leaves for Cuba and leaves Cuba for America. A scene I imagine as just standing in her place. One foot inside a plane destined for a country she knew only as a name, a color on a map, or glossy photos from drugstore magazines. Her other foot anchored to the platform of her patria, her hand clutched around one suitcase, taking only what she needs most. Hand-colored photographs of her family, her wedding veil, the doorknob of her house, a jar of dirt from her backyard. Goodbye letters she won't open for years. The sorrowful drone of engines, one last deep breath of familiar air she'll take with her. One last glimpse at all she'd ever known. The palm trees wave goodbye as she steps onto the plane. The mountains shrink from her eyes as she lifts off into another life to love a country as if you've lost one. I hear her. Once upon a time, reading picture books over my shoulder at bedtime, both of us learning English, sounding out words as strange as the talking animals and fair-haired princesses in their pages. I taste her first attempts at macaroni and cheese, but with chorizo and peppers. And her shame over Thanksgiving turkeys, always dry, but countered by her perfect pork pernil and garlic yuca. I smell the rain of those mornings, huddled as one under one umbrella, waiting for the bus to her 10-hour days at the cash register. And at night, the zzz, zzz of her sewing her own blouses and quinceañera dresses for her grown nieces, still in Cuba, guessing at their sizes. And the gowns she tell the neighbors to save for a rusty white sedan, no hubcaps, no air conditioning, sweating all the way through our first vacation to Florida theme parks to love a country as if you've lost one, as if it were you on a plane departing from America forever. Clouds closing like curtains on your country, the last scene in which you're a madman, scribbling the names of your favorite flowers, trees, and birds you'd never see again. Your address and phone number you'd never use again. The color of your father's eyes and your mother's hair, terrified you could somehow forget these. To love a country, as if I was my mother last spring, hobbling, insisting I help her climb all the way up to the U.S. Capitol, as if she were here before you instead of me, explaining her tears, her cheeks pink as the cherry blossoms coloring the air that day, when she stopped, turned to me, and said, "You know, mijo, I've been thinking, it isn't where you're born that matters. It's where you choose to die. That's your country." So, my mother, I think, poses an interesting question for us, right? We don't always get to choose where we're born, unless you're like, knocking, let me out. I want to be born in Spain. But the idea of, which is figurative, of course, but the idea that where you choose to die. And I think my mom has come full circle to understand that most of her life has been lived in the United States, that she's grown, that she's raised two beautiful, wonderful sons that call her every day. That was a joke. But you know, the idea that her life has been made here, and that, and in some ways, so many immigrants. I mean, we make America what it is because we're choosing, in a way, this country. We're choosing to make this our home, and that is a very powerful thing to say. You're not just accepting what you're given, but you're choosing, and choice is amazing. So this slide, change of pace here. You can guess which of these three activities little gay Ricky liked to do least, and if not, that's going to be on the quiz with Phyllis, and if you get that one wrong, you're out. It's obviously my nightmare days of Little League because, you know, every Cuban has to play baseball. You know, it's like the star. They had no idea there was any other sport. There was no swimming. There was no basketball. But anyway, there's another interesting intersection for me between this idea of home and my culture, and it's this idea of cultural sexuality, which is something I try to work with in LGBT communities. And it's not the same thing to grow up as a little gay kid in a suburb of Miami, you know, behind a bowling alley as I did, than it is to grow up, you know, some other gay kid, perhaps an Asian American kid growing up in, you know, Topeka, Kansas or whatnot. But the idea that we can't separate these parts of ourselves, that our sexual identity and so much else goes into who we are, as it's all connected also with our cultural identity. So there isn't one kind of homophobia, and there isn't one kind of LGBT person, but that these things are intimately related. And I try to bring that out in my writing and support Latino communities because we have very different challenges, things that Latino communities have to talk about that don't need to happen in Provincetown. So this idea of cultural sexuality and this idea of home as safe space for the gay child and the gay teenager, hell, the gay 20-something or the gay 40-something. This idea that we always grow up or thinking about that place where we would live our lives without shame and without fear and this idea of somewhere over the rainbow, right? And so some of this is in this poem, but mostly it's about my grandmother who is like the star in my life for very bad reasons and very good reasons, but she was a woman who was as xenophobic as she was homophobic. So you can imagine how the wires got crossed in my family. So anything that she didn't understand culturally was also queer. And I won't say gay because that probably wasn't in her vocabulary, but queer. So I'm talking like things like Fruit Loops, queer, gay. What are you going to do? Easy cheese, gay. The Cub Scouts, gay. Little House on the Prairie, gay. The Brady Bunch, gayer than gay. Okay, so I didn't have much wiggle room, and so this poem is written. It's kind of a whimsical look at my grandmother, and it sort of touches on that idea of that intersection and that idea of xenophobia when it meets homophobia. But we all know as Latinos, right, we have to deal with this thing of machismo, right? And this is really what this poem is about. It's about that sense of how it doesn't matter as long as it's all about pretense, right? It's all about how you act or how you present yourself. So the homophobia isn't sort of this eternal damnation kind of homophobia, but of course we understand that it's about the idea of femininity is in a weird way celebrated in Latino culture, but also reviled in some ways when it's expressed through the male, right? As my grandmother used to say, which I can laugh at it now, but es mejor serlo y parecerlo que no serlo y parecerlo, right? It sounds so much better. I'm sure, I guess it wasn't just my grandmother. But it's so hard to translate, but it sort of says, what she was saying was, you know, sort of through her euphemism in a way, was to say that it's more noble or more honorable to be gay and not act like it than it is to act gay even if you're not gay, right? And so this is something, anyway, here we are. This is my grandmother. And this poem is in her voice, so she can incriminate herself, and I hope you don't laugh with her, but I hope you laugh at her. Queer theory, according to my grandmother. Never drink your soda with a straw. Men don't use straws. Milkshakes? Maybe. Stop buying your mother's Avon catalog and the men's underwear and those Sears flyers. I've seen you. Stay out of her Tupperware parties and perfume bottles. Don't let her kiss you. She kisses you much too much. Avoid hugging men, but if you must, pat them real hard on the back, even if it's your father. Must you keep that cat? Don't pet him so much. Mijo, why don't you like dogs? Never play house, even if you're the husband, and quit hanging out with that Henry kid. He's too pale. And I don't care what you call them, those Yi Joes of his are dolls. Don't draw rainbows or flowers or sunsets. I've seen you. Don't draw at all. No coloring books either. Put away your crayons, your Play-Doh, your Legos. Where are those Hot Wheels, your laser gun and handcuffs? Those knives I gave you for Christmas. Never fly a kite or roller skate, but light all the firecrackers you want, kill all the lizards you can, cut up worms and feed them to that cat of yours. Don't sit Indian style with your legs crossed, you're no Indio. And stop click-clacking your sandals, you're no Tropicana chorus girl. And for God's sake, never, ever pee sitting down. I've seen you. Never take a bubble bath or wash your hair with shampoo. Shampoo is for women. So is conditioner, so is el mousse, so is hand lotion. Never file your nails or blow dry your hair. Go to the barber shop with your abuelo. You're not unisex, are you? Stay out of the kitchen. Los hombres don't cook, they eat. Eat anything you want, except deviled eggs, blow pops, croissants, bagels, maybe. Cucumber sandwiches and those petite fours. Don't watch Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie. Don't stare at the $6 million man. I've seen you. Never dance alone in your room. Donna Summer, Barry Manilow, the Captain Antonio, Bette Midler, and all musicals forbidden. Posters of kittens, Star Wars, or the Eiffel Tower forbidden. Those fancy books on architecture and art, I threw them in the trash. No, you can't wear cologne or puka shells. And I better not catch you in those clogs. If you grow a ponytail, I'm cutting it off. Okay? What? No, you can't pierce your ear, left or right side. I don't care. You will not look like a goddamn queer. I've seen you, even though I know you are one. So, thank you. In that journey, in that cultural journey, that journey from home, that cultural to sort of like cultural coming of age journey, eventually I went to Cuba in 1994, which was an amazing experience, as you can imagine for anyone that has done that. And it was like sort of this sort of storybook of this pop-up storybook of your life, just sort of something you could walk into. All these old photos and letters and family that my mother would talk about suddenly come to life. All these ghosts suddenly come to life. And so I've gone to Cuba ever since. I go about every 3, 4, 5 years and to reconnect with my family and whatnot. And it was just such a necessary piece of what I needed to do. It was part of that journey. And it sort of, it's no wonder that when I started writing poetry, when you start investigating your life, when you start investigating your history, your family history, that it was such a natural move to go to Cuba. And so I wrote this poem, which is not as melancholy, but as a fun piece, and it opens the second half of my first book, which is all about my first trip to Cuba. And it deals with my genesis into Cuba. Let me give you a little anecdote. So I was writing and reading a lot, and a friend of mine turned to me and said, "Ay, los cubanos se creen que son el ombligo del mundo." And I love how I don't really need to translate in this room, but for the benefit of those, so literally, the literal translation is that the Cubans think they're the belly button of the world. Of course, figurative meaning that that they're, come on, I can take it. Look, Cubano tienen fama. We're famous for like sort of being this sort of really self-centered, almost to the point of arrogant, right? Like it's all about Cuba, blah, 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 even to the point that drives me crazy, right? But of course, my friend, who was no longer my friend after that moment, but I started thinking about that and having fun with that and thinking about how we have to have fun with our own stereotypes, right? And it just happened to be that I was reading the story of creation in the Bible because I just love some of that language and was thinking about that. And I thought, what if the story of creation was written by a Cuban? What would that look like? And of course, you read this to a Cuban crowd and they don't get it. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, that's the one I read. That's the version I read. But really, seriously, what the poem taught me was it gave me empathy because I realized why Cubans do that is, and each of our cultures has our unique sort of idiosyncrasies and nuances, is because they, in their minds, they're going back to something they can't go back to, right? And so it's this idea of self-preservation, and to preserve your culture in some ways, you exaggerate it, right? You self-celebrate it because it's a way in some ways of keeping it together, because in some ways in your mind, in your psyche, you're taking that back in some ways. So it's just the nuance of the culture, and it's just, again, if we can't laugh at ourselves, and this is important for us, then I just think it's important for us to be able to think about that and laugh at our own idiosyncrasies. So here we go. This is, and of course the title came to me, Havanasis, which is a play on Genesis. In the beginning, before God created Cuba, the earth was chaos, empty of form and without music. The Spirit of God stirred over the dark tropical waters, and God said, "Let there be music." And a soft conga beat began at 1-2 in the background of the chaos. Then God called up Yemaya and said, "Let the waters under heaven amass together and let dry land appear." It was done. God called the fertile red earth Cuba and the amassed waters the Caribbean. And God saw this was good, tapping his foot to the conga beat. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout papaya and cocoa and white cocoa flesh, malanga roots and mangoes and all shades of gold and amber. Let there be tobacco and cafe and sugar for the cafe. Let there be rum. Let there be waving plantains and guayabas and everything tropical-like." God saw this was good, then fashioned palm trees, his pièce de résistance. Then God said, "Let there be a moon and stars to light the nights over Club Tropicana, and a sun for 365 days of the year." God saw this was good. He called the night nightlife, the day he called paradise. Then God said, "Let there be fish and fowl of every kind." And there was spicy shrimp enchilado, chicken fricassé, codfish bacalaos, and fritters. But he wanted something more exciting and said, "Enough. Let there be pork." And there was pork, deep fried, whole roasted, pork rinds and sausage. He fashioned goats, used their skins for bongos and batus. He made claves and maracas and every kind of percussion instrument known to man. Then, out of a red lump of clay, God made a Taino and set him in a city he called Habana. Then he said, "It is not good that Taino be alone. Let me make him helpmates." And so God created La Mulata to dance Huabanco and song with Taino, the Guajiro to cultivate his land and his folklore, Cachita, the sorceress, to strike the rhythm of his music, and a poet to work the verses of their paradise. God gave them dominion over all the creatures and musical instruments, and said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Eat pork, drink rum, make music, and dance." On the seventh day, God rested from the labors of his creation. He smiled upon the celebration and listened to their music. So the joke was on me on that poem. I read it at this big fancy Breadloaf's Writers Conference, gosh, maybe 15 years ago. And I read right before Edward Hirsch. And he got up after me and in a good-natured way said, I got to tell you, my good Jewish mother wouldn't forgive me. I didn't tell you that God did not create pork. In my head, the audacity of a Judeo God creating pork. So the arrogance and the self-centered of Cuban. The joke was on me. I was like, okay, yeah, I guess the poem fit its purpose. So Cuba was great, but I think there was also this sense of, remember the two real imagined worlds? It answered a lot of questions. It filled in a lot of blanks about that space, but I still realized I hadn't been to America, or what I thought was America. So I moved to Hartford after my engineering career. I took a hiatus from my engineering career and got a job in Hartford, Connecticut. And I thought, oh boy, sleigh rides in the snow, singing jingle bells in a one-horse hope and say. Me and Martha Stewart doing arts and crafts in Westport every Tuesday. Surely they were still wearing those. Mind you, we were a very working class family. I had never been up north. I mean, I didn't get on a plane until I was 23 years old. But I thought, they still had those pilgrim shoes, and they're walking around those pilgrim shoes from the dittos I colored in class, and surely there were Brady Bunch houses everywhere. Maybe at last I'd find America, because in some ways Cuba was great, but also I couldn't even really live there, even if they couldn't really connect in that way. So I decided to chase that fantasy. Of course, that didn't work out either, because we all know that, Hartford at the time was one of the largest enclaves of Puerto Rican communities in the country. So it was like, cool. I had a Portuguese Cuban bakery. It was close. But anyway, it was a delight, but also in a weird way, like, okay, this doesn't really exist either, So then I decided, well, what is home? What is that quest? I got the travel bug that we do sort of in our early 30s, and traveled all over, just again with that same question in my home. Maybe I'm really belong in Venice or Barcelona or London. I lived in Guatemala for a little while. I lived in Brazil for a little while, always with that question of home. Eventually, I stumbled upon this quote that sort of changed my thinking. It's a quote by Pascal that says, "The sole cause of a man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room." Notice the sexist language, but I can't change the quote. But the idea was, what was that room I left? Maybe this whole quest for home is a wild goose chase. And so I decided to move back to Miami, to that world between worlds, thinking maybe this is the only place where I can actually feel at home, living between places. And of course, that didn't pan out either. And so this poem speaks to this idea of you can't go back home. The story behind this is that we did move back. I took my partner, Mark, to Marco Island. You can't make this up, which is just a few hours from Miami. And it's this place that I've been going since I was a kid, poor man's staycation, basically. There's a place out of my childhood into my adolescence, and I went back to show him and to sort of take this trip down memory lane, thinking nothing had changed, because why would it, right? In our minds, our memories stay intact. And of course, everything had changed. And I started cussing like a sailor, and just like really angry. And my partner Mark said, "You sound just like your mother." And I thought, wrong thing to say in any given situation. Though I love her dearly, but we're too alike, but that's part of the reason. But I realized I caught myself because I was speaking about Marco Island in the same way that in some ways my parents spoke about Cuba. And this idea that Marco Island, in a sense, became my Cuba. In the sense, I also realized that this idea of home and belonging is not something that just belongs to us as Latinos. It's really a fundamental universal question. That place of where we belong is so important, and what that means. And I think that what Conexion is sort of putting together for us is realizing that shared common humanity, that who we are and what we love, and that sense of belonging and home and community is something we all share, right? It's something important. So anyway, this poem came about, which sort of illustrates what was going on at the time. Yeah. So this is the place we used to stay was called the Gulf Motel, and the title is "Looking for the Gulf Motel," Marco Island, Florida. There should be nothing here I don't remember. The Gulf Motel with mermaid lampposts and ship's wheel in the lobby should still be rising out of the sand like a cake decoration. My brother and I should still be pretending we don't know our parents, embarrassing us as they roll the luggage cart past the front desk, loaded with our scruffy suitcases, 24 loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a pork roast reeking garlic through the marble lobby. All because we can't afford to eat out, mijo. Not even on vacation. Only 2 hours from our home in Miami, but far enough away to be thrilled by the wider sands on the west coast of Florida, where I should still be, for the first time, watching the sun set instead of rise over the ocean. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My mother should still be in the kitchenette of the Gulf Motel, her daisy sandals from Kmart still squeaking across the linoleum, still gorgeous in her teal swimsuit and amber earrings, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo, adding sprinkles of onion powder and dollops of tomato sauce. My father should still be in a terrycloth jacket, smoking, clinking a glass of amber whiskey in the sunset at the Gulf Motel, watching us dive into the pool, 2 sons he'll never see grow into men who will be proud of him. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi. My father should still be alive, slow dancing with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Gulf Motel. No music, only the waves keeping time. A song only their minds hear 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest, like the moon resting on the sea. And the stars should still be turning around them. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother should still be 13, sneaking rum in the bathroom and sculpting naked women from sand. And I should still be 8 years old, dazzled by seashells and how many seconds I can hold my breath underwater. But I'm not. I'm 38, driving up Collier Boulevard, looking for the Gulf Motel, for everything that should still be, but isn't. I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach in my past. I want to chase the snowbirds away with their tacky McMansions and yachts. I want to turn the golf courses back into mangroves. I want to find the Gulf Motel exactly as it was and pretend for just a moment that nothing I've lost is lost. Thanks. So, I can read one last poem. And so what do you do when Miami doesn't work out? Well, you move to Maine. What's at the other end of I-95? Let's find out. So, I mean, there were some practical reasons for moving to Maine, but it was also a welcome change. Just, again, this idea of how Miami wasn't the same city I left behind. And so this is us in Maine. That's my partner, Mark, my dog, Joey. And these shots were actually taken on different days, but we just wear flannel all the time. Like, it's so butch. And that is not me skiing. Unfortunately, and I think Oz will testify to this, I had some genetic tests done a few years ago, and apparently Cubans have a defective gene that doesn't allow them to ski. Like, it's they buy it in Bethel, but anyway, we live in a ski resort town. So I was had given up on the question of home, place, and belonging. Had accepted, embraced my culture, thought Cuba was still in some ways back then an impossibility. This America that I was reaching for wasn't quite. And I thought, you know what? It's okay. living in the question is part of the beauty of life, and this idea that I actually am blessed by this multiplicity of identities and homes, that I can change, that I can like belong to different things, and I don't have to pick and choose. And in some ways, I had sort of found some kind of peace with that question, or at least put it aside for a while. And again, asking what is home is like asking what is love. It changes throughout our life as we experience different things. There's never one final answer. So while we were living in Maine, guess who calls? And essentially, the assignment was write a poem about America. And so all those questions of home and belonging sort of just got tossed up back in the air. And what was really emotionally sort of really wrenching, and the really emotional challenge of writing the poem was, believe it or not, till that moment, some part of me still felt that I needed to be little Peter Brady or Marcia Brady, which would have been cooler. But some part of me still felt that I wasn't American. Some part of me felt that I didn't have the authority to write this poem. I'm some little gay Cuban kid from Miami, and a lot of the process of getting to writing the poem, and what I'm even experiencing now, which has been beautiful, was the idea that, no, this is my country, and I have every right to write this poem. And so that's really been the gift of the inauguration for me. It wasn't meeting Beyonce, which was so cool. And yes, for gay or straight in the audience, she's just as beautiful in person. She's, oh my God. But anyway, and of course, meeting him was, of course, amazing, right? But really, the greatest gift that I take with me is to finally feel like there is a place at the table, not only for me, but for sort of all the millions of people that I represented as a Latino, as an immigrant by 45 days, as a gay man for our LGBT community. And so it took on that tone for me. It was really sort of what I walked away with. It was also the sense of understanding that America is a work in progress. That my story, my mother's story, a woman who grew up in a dirt floor home in Cuba, that in some ways that has always been part of the American narrative, a narrative that hasn't always been acknowledged, but a grand part of the American narrative. But that narrative continues to evolve, and that it's a work in progress, and it's our duty to our country, our duty to our fellow citizens, our duty to our fellow human beings, to continue to write that narrative, to write a sentence, to write a paragraph, to write a chapter, to write a whole damn book if you need to, and more importantly, to write those stories for those that can't speak yet. And this idea, and I know we're facing very, very challenging times right now, and it's part of where we almost need to step even more to the plate to continue to affect and change that narrative with hope, with grace, with dignity, with faith. And yes, America takes 4 steps forward and 3 steps back and vice versa, but we have to maintain those kinds of, we have to maintain that faith and hope. Without that, we've lost the battle. So those were the lessons and the gifts that I took from the inauguration. And I think this poem in some ways is more relevant today as a message than it was even 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago. And the idea that we get to create this country together, supposedly, and also that at the end of the day, it's all about our common shared humanity. And I think I will go to the grave, no matter what, believing that this is one of the greatest social experiments to this day, even today, that we have. And it's up to us. It's up to us. And it's up to us even when we're, beaten down a little bit, to continue to do as we're doing here today, to do what Conexion does, to bring people together, to build bridges instead of walls. That's ultimately what it's all about. So I'm going to just read you a little excerpt and close on this, which is from the inaugural memoir of what's going on in my mind while I'm sitting somewhere in there. In the moment, I feel America standing as one, putting differences aside for a moment and taking a deep collective breath. We pay tribute to something far bigger and more important than any one of us, and I truly feel like one of us, one of we the people, in the echoes of the president's and other speeches. I embrace America in a way I never had or thought I could, feeling for the first time that I belong, truly belong to one country. Not an imaginary ideal from TV or nostalgic Cuba floating in the sea of my parents' memories, but a real, tangible place that is mine, was mine all along. I turn to my mother and whisper, "Mama, I guess we're finally Americanos." Senator Schumer introduces me and calls me up to the podium. My mother squeezes my shoulder. I stand more confident than I imagined I would or could be, transfixed by the moment that is no longer about me or my poem or my glory, but about our country. Still, I'm surprised when the president and vice president stand up to greet me and shake my hand on my way to the podium. They both whisper something in my ear that I can't make out, but their gracious gestures speak silently to my heart, silently, as if saying, "Richard, here is your country. This is your story. Here, your home." I step up to the podium, look out over the crowd, a patchwork quilt of lives, of stories spread across our ground, under our sky, beneath our sun. I take it all in as I take one deep breath, then another. This is for them. This is for us, for all of us. I think to myself and begin speaking into our wind. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, America, one today. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging over the Rockies. One light, waking up rooftops, under each one a story, told by our silent gestures moving behind windows. My face, your face. Millions of faces in morning's mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. Pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges, arrayed like rainbows begging our praise. Silver trucks, heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us, on our way to clean tables, read ledgers, or save lives, to teach geometry or ring up groceries as my mother did for 20 years, so I could write this poem for us today. All of us, as vital as the one light we move through. The same light on blackboards with lessons for the day, equations to solve, history to question, or atoms imagined. The I have a dream, we keep dreaming, or the impossible vocabulary of sorrow that won't explain the empty desks of 20 children marked absent today and forever. Many prayers, but one light, breathing color into stained glass windows, life into the faces of bronze statues, warmth onto the steps of our museums and park benches as mothers watch your children slide into the day. One ground, our ground, rooting us to every stalk of corn, every head of wheat sown by sweat and hands gleaning coal or planting windmills in deserts and hilltops, Hands digging trenches, hands routing pipes and cables, hands as worn as my father's, cutting sugarcane so my brother and I could have books and shoes. The dust of our farms and deserts, our cities and plains mingled by one wind, our breath. Breathe. Hear it through the day's gorgeous din of honking cabs, buses launching down avenues, the symphony of footsteps, guitars, and screeching subways, the unexpected songbird on your clothesline. Hear squeaky playground swings, trains whistling, or whispers across cafe tables. Hear the doors we open for each other all day, saying, hello, shalom, buongiorno, howdy, namaste, or buenos dias, in the language my mother taught me. In every language spoken into one wind, carrying our lives without prejudice as these words break from my lips. One sky since the Appalachians and Sierras claimed their majesty, and the Mississippi and Colorado worked their way to the sea. Thank the work of our hands, weaving steel into bridges, finishing one more report for the boss on time, stitching another wound or uniform. The first brushstroke on a portrait, or the last floor on the Freedom Tower, jutting into a sky that yields to our resilience. One sky toward which we sometimes lift our eyes, tired from work. Some days guessing at the weather of our lives. Some days giving thanks for a love that loves you back. Sometimes praising a mother who knew how to give, or forgiving a father who couldn't give what you wanted. Still, we head home. Home. Through the gloss of rain or weight of snow or the plum blush of dusk, but always, always home, always under one sky, our sky, and always one moon, like a silent drum tapping on every rooftop and every window of one country. All of us facing the stars and hope. A new constellation waiting for us to map it, waiting for us to name it together.